The parking lot at Camp Pendleton's Maine, gates stretched wide under the California sun, shimmering with heat that rose from asphalt like desert mirages. Marines in their daily utilities moved between vehicles with the casual efficiency of men and women who'd learned to make every second count, heading toward the chow hall or back to barracks after another grinding day of training. The lot was a testament to military pay grades, mostly reliable sedans, a few lifted pickup trucks belonging to the corporals who'd blown their enlistment bonuses on 35-inch tires, and the occasional sports car that screamed, "Fresh lieutenant with nothing to lose." But it was the vehicle in Space C-47 that drew attention that Tuesday afternoon in August, an attention that began with smirks and evolved into something else entirely. The truck was a 1987 Ford F-150, powder blue paint faded to something closer to primer gray on the hood and roof. Rust bloomed along the wheel wells like spreading wounds, and the passenger side mirror was held in place with what appeared to be an entire roll of duct tape, and the stubborn optimism of someone who refused to let anything stay broken. The bed was dented in 3 places, each crater telling a story of impacts that would have totaled lesser vehicles. It wasn't just old, it was ancient by modern standards, a relic from an era when trucks were built like tanks and expected to run forever on nothing but spite and regular oil changes. Someone had spray-painted over a section of rust on the tailgate, but the color didn't quite match, leaving a patch that looked like a poorly healed scar. Lance Corporal Rodriguez was the first to notice it that morning, walking past with 2 of his platoon mates from Weapons Company. He'd stopped mid-stride, coffee cup halfway to his lips, and just stared. "Jesus Christ," he'd muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. "Who the hell is driving that thing onto base?" His tone carried that particular brand of military mockery, not quite mean, but certainly not kind, the verbal equivalent of a shove between brothers who know exactly how hard they can push. By noon, the truck had become a minor celebrity. Marines detoured through that section of the lot just to see it, pulling out phones to snap pictures for their group chats. Someone had even created a running commentary on the battalion's unofficial Instagram account, speculating about whether the vehicle would survive the drive home or simply disintegrate from embarrassment. But it was the license plate that changed everything. Not immediately. Most of them walked past it a dozen times before someone actually read the characters instead of just glancing at the rusted frame around it. The plate was standard California issue, blue letters on white background, but the combination of numbers and letters told a story that none of them had bothered to ask about. When Corporal Henderson finally looked, really looked, she stopped walking so suddenly that the Marine behind her nearly collided with her shoulder. The parking lot had mostly cleared by 1700 hours, the day's heat beginning to fade into the comfortable warmth of a California evening. The old Ford F-150 sat alone in its space, looking even more decrepit as shadows stretched long across the asphalt. Most of the Marines who'd mocked it earlier had already headed out, their own vehicles humming smoothly to life with the reliable purr of machines less than 5 years old. But Corporal Henderson remained, standing 15 feet from the truck's tailgate, her eyes fixed on that license plate with an expression that had moved well past curiosity into something approaching reverence. She'd pulled out her phone not to take a mocking photo, but to confirm what she suspected, her fingers moving quickly across the screen as she searched for information that would either validate or deny the cold realization spreading through her chest. The plate read 50 NRTH. To anyone not paying attention, it looked random, possibly someone's attempt at vanity without wanting to pay for actual vanity plates. But Henderson had grown up in a Marine Corps family. Her father had served, her uncle had served, and she'd spent her childhood listening to stories told in hushed, reverent tones about battles that had happened before she was born. Those stories always included call signs, those radio designations that became more important than birth names in the crucible of combat. And this particular combination of characters wasn't random at all. It was a call sign, a very specific call sign, one that belonged to a legend most Marines knew only through unofficial histories and late-night stories shared between deployments. Valkyrie 50 November, Northern Valkyrie. The A-10 Warthog pilot who'd saved an entire platoon in Afghanistan's Korangal Valley back in 2012, who'd flown so low through a canyon that Taliban fighters swore the aircraft's shadow had killed their commander, who'd expended every round of 30mm ammunition, and then made 2 more passes just to terrify the enemy with the sound of those turbofans howling through the mountains. Henderson felt her hands shaking as she lowered her phone. The official records were sparse. The military didn't publicize close air support missions the way they did special operations raids or infantry assaults. But the unofficial accounts, the stories passed between grunts who'd been there or knew someone who'd been there, painted a picture of a pilot who'd redefined what it meant to provide danger-close support. A pilot who'd broken at least a dozen regulations about minimum altitude and engagement distances, who'd ignored her flight lead's orders to pull off target, who'd stayed in the fight until the Marines on the ground could extract their wounded and fall back to defensible terrain. The after-action reports had been sanitized, the pilot's name redacted in any documents that made it to public record, but the call sign had survived. Northern Valkyrie. And now that call sign was bolted to the back of a rusted truck in a Camp Pendleton parking lot. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Gunnery Sergeant Price walking toward her, his utilities still bearing dust from the afternoon's training exercise. He was old Corps, a man who'd been a lance corporal during the First Battle of Fallujah and had somehow survived long enough to make it to his 20th year. His eyes tracked from Henderson's face to the truck, then to the license plate, and she watched his expression shift through the same progression hers had: confusion, recognition, disbelief, certainty. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual command presence. Henderson nodded slowly. "It's exactly what you think it is, Gunny." They stood in silence for almost a minute, 2 Marines separated by rank and experience, but united in the sudden understanding that they'd spent the day mocking someone who'd earned more respect in a single mission than most of them would accumulate in an entire career. The sun was touching the horizon when the truck's owner finally appeared, walking across the parking lot with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. She was maybe 5'4", wearing worn jeans and a faded blue t-shirt that had USAF printed small on the left chest, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that showed threads of gray at the temples. She carried a backpack over one shoulder and held the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, his other hand clutching a toy airplane. An A-10, Henderson noticed, the distinctive twin-engine design unmistakable even in miniature. The woman moved with the efficient economy of motion that marked former military, not the exaggerated bearing of someone trying to look tough, but the natural confidence of someone who'd done difficult things and survived them. Her face was weathered in the way that suggested long hours in harsh conditions, crow's feet at the corners of her eyes, a thin scar running along her left jawline that makeup might have hidden, but that she'd made no attempt to conceal. Price stepped forward instinctively, then caught himself, uncertain of the protocol for this situation. Henderson felt the same paralysis. What did you say to someone like this? How did you apologize for mockery you'd participated in through silence, for photographs taken and jokes made about a vehicle that probably represented the entirety of its owner's transportation budget? The woman noticed them watching and offered a small, tired smile that suggested she was well accustomed to judgment. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying the faint rasp of someone who'd spent years breathing dust and jet fuel. "I know the truck's not much to look at. I'm working on it." The boy looked up at her with complete trust, oblivious to the significance of the moment, swinging his toy through the air with sound effects that were surprisingly accurate for someone so young. "Mom, can we get tacos?" he asked. "You promised tacos after the dentist." The woman, Valkyrie, Henderson's mind insisted. "This is Valkyrie 50 November standing in front of you. unlocked the truck's driver's side door with a key that stuck in the ancient mechanism, requiring a practiced jiggle and twist that spoke of thousands of repetitions. "Yeah, buddy, we can get tacos," she said, boosting the boy into the bench seat with the practiced efficiency of single parenthood. She was about to climb in herself when Price finally found his voice. "Ma'am," he said, the word coming out with more force than he'd intended. She paused, one foot on the running board, and looked at him with an expression that was patient but wary. "That license plate," Price continued, gesturing toward the back of the truck. 50 November, that was your call sign." The woman's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went very still, the way deer freeze when they sense a predator. "Long time ago," she said carefully. "Different life." Price straightened unconsciously, his body responding to the presence of someone who'd done what this woman had done regardless of their current positions in the military hierarchy. "Ma'am, I was a corporal with 1st Battalion 5th Marines during the Korangal deployment. I wasn't there for your mission, but I knew guys who were. They're alive because of what you did." The woman's hand tightened on the truck's door frame, knuckles going white. "They're alive because they did their jobs," she said quietly. "I just made sure they had the time to do it." Henderson stepped forward, her earlier paralysis breaking. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. We saw your truck and we made assumptions. We didn't know." The woman looked between them, understanding dawning in her expression. "You saw the rust bucket and figured whoever was driving it was a joke," she said, not unkindly. "I get it. I've been getting it for about 5 years now, ever since the divorce wiped out my savings and I had to choose between a nice car and keeping my son in a good school district." She shrugged, the gesture carrying a weight of experience that made Henderson feel suddenly very young. "The truck runs. It gets us where we need to go. That's more than a lot of people can say about their fancy rides." The boy's voice called out from inside the cab, impatient with the delay. "Mom, I'm hungry." The woman smiled again, that same tired expression, and started to climb into the truck. Price spoke quickly, words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "Ma'am, if you ever need anything, maintenance, repairs, hell, if you need someone to watch your kid while you deal with life, you call the Battalion S1 shop and ask for Gunnery Sergeant Price. We take care of our own, and you're about as our own as it gets." The woman paused again, this time with something that might have been surprise crossing her features. "I appreciate that, Gunny, but I'm not a Marine. I was Air Force and I've been out for 8 years. I'm not your own anything." Price shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you saved Marine lives under fire. That makes you a Marine as far as I'm concerned and as far as anyone in my battalion is concerned. The uniform doesn't matter. The action does." For a long moment, the woman just looked at him, and Henderson watched emotions flicker across her face too quickly to identify. Gratitude, suspicion, exhaustion, something that might have been hope buried deep beneath layers of hard-learned self-reliance. Finally, she nodded once, a sharp gesture that carried military precision despite the civilian clothes and the rusted truck and the years that had passed since she'd worn a flight suit. "Jamie Cortez," she said, offering her hand. "Former captain, United States Air Force, though I'm pretty sure they'd rather forget I existed." Price took her hand, his grip firm but respectful. "Gunny Price. And ma'am, speaking as someone who knows what it's like to be erased from the official record, they don't get to decide whether you existed. We do. The ones who were there or who know people who were there." Cortez's grip tightened for just a second, acknowledgement passing between them that required no words. Then she released his hand, climbed into the truck, and started the engine. It coughed twice before catching, belching a small cloud of blue smoke that spoke of worn piston rings and deferred maintenance, but then it settled into a surprisingly smooth idle. She backed out of the space with practiced precision, the truck's size requiring attention in the tight confines of the parking lot, and pulled toward the exit. Henderson and Price watched the vehicle until it disappeared around the corner, the license plate visible until the last second. "We need to do something about this," Henderson said quietly. Price nodded, his mind already working through logistics. Yeah, we do, but carefully. She's proud, you saw that. We help wrong, she'll tell us to go to hell." Henderson pulled out her phone, already opening the battalion's group chat. "Then we help right. We find out what she needs without making her ask for it. And we make sure every swinging dick in this battalion knows who she is and what she did. The story of the rusted F-150 and its license plate spread through Camp Pendleton like wildfire through dry grass, moving from weapons company to the entire battalion by the next morning, then across to other units by afternoon. But this time, the story was different. This time, it came with context, with history, with the kind of reverential detail that Marines reserved for their own legends. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, who'd been the first to mock the truck, now found himself defending it aggressively in the chow hall when a Marine from another company made a disparaging comment. "That truck," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of recent conversion, "belongs to a pilot who saved 32 Marines in Korangal. She flew through a canyon so narrow her wingtips were 10 feet from the rock walls on both sides. She killed 47 Taliban fighters in one mission and expended every round she had doing it. So you can shut your mouth about her truck, or you can step outside and we can discuss it further." The other Marine, sensing he'd stumbled into something beyond his understanding, wisely chose silence. But the encounter illustrated how quickly the narrative had shifted. By the end of the week, Marines were actively looking for the old Ford F-150 in the parking lot, not to mock it but to see it, to stand near something tangible connected to a story they'd only heard in fragments. Someone had posted a detailed account of the Korangal mission on the battalion's unofficial Reddit thread, piecing together information from declassified after-action reports, interviews with survivors, and the handful of details that had leaked over the years. The post read like an action movie script, but everyone who'd served in Afghanistan knew it was real because they'd heard versions of it from a dozen different sources, each one adding details but never contradicting the core facts. The mission had happened in late September 2012, during what was supposed to be a routine patrol through the Korangal Valley. 1st Platoon, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion 5th Marines had been tasked with clearing a village suspected of housing Taliban fighters who'd been launching attacks on Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The platoon had 32 Marines, a Navy corpsman, and an Afghan interpreter, young men mostly, with a few salty corporals who'd done previous deployments and knew enough to be nervous about the Korangal's reputation. The valley was called the Valley of Death, for good reasons that had nothing to do with poetry and everything to do with terrain that favored ambush, with enemy fighters who'd been fighting in these mountains since before any of the Marines had been born, with elevations that made air support difficult and extraction nearly impossible if things went wrong. Things went wrong almost immediately. The patrol had made it maybe 2 kilometers into the valley when the world exploded around them. Machine gun fire from 3 sides, RPGs screaming in from elevated positions, mortars dropping with terrifying precision that suggested forward observers who'd been tracking the platoon's movement for the entire approach. The Marines went aground behind whatever cover they could find, rocks, a low stone wall, the slight depression of a dry irrigation ditch, and started returning fire, but they were badly outgunned and caught in a kill zone that had clearly been prepared well in advance. The platoon commander, a first lieutenant on his first deployment, made the right call immediately. He radioed for close air support and started organizing a fighting withdrawal back toward a better defensive position they'd passed about 400 meters back. But withdrawals under fire require covering fire, and the Taliban fighters weren't interested in letting the Marines disengage. Every time a fire team tried to move, they got pinned down by concentrated fire from multiple positions. The corpsman had already taken shrapnel to his leg trying to reach a wounded lance corporal, and the radio chatter was getting increasingly desperate as the platoon commander realized they were genuinely in danger of being overrun. The initial air support request had estimated enemy strength at maybe 20 fighters. The Marines on the ground were reporting at least 60, possibly more, with heavy weapons and clear command and control. This wasn't a random ambush. It was a coordinated attack by experienced fighters who'd chosen their ground perfectly. The closest air support was a pair of F-16s out of Bagram, 30 minutes away. The platoon probably had 10 minutes before their ammunition situation became critical. The operations center at FOB Phoenix was scrambling everything they had, a PASH, another Marine platoon, even discussing a quick reaction force insertion by helicopter. But everything was too far away or would take too long to reach the kill zone. Then a voice came over the radio, clear and calm despite the static, with a call sign that wasn't on any of the scheduled flight rosters for that day. Chaos 3-1, this is Valkyrie 50 November. I'm 12 minutes out, carrying full combat load. Hold what you've got and get ready to mark targets. The platoon commander, call sign Chaos 3-1, responded with the desperate relief of a man who'd been contemplating writing letters to 32 sets of parents. Valkyrie 50, we've got enemy positions north, northwest, and west of our location. Heavy weapons confirmed. We need immediate suppression so we can displace. The voice came back, still calm, carrying the kind of confidence that only comes from having done difficult things before. Copy all. I'm coming in from the south at Angels 4. You're going to hear me before you see me. When you hear the gun, that's your signal to move. Don't stop moving until I tell you to stop. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog for its ungainly appearance and savage effectiveness, is built around a gun. Not equipped with a gun, not designed to carry a gun, built around one. The GAU-8 Avenger is a 7-barrel Gatling gun that fires 30mm rounds at a rate of 3,900 per round per minute, each round capable of penetrating armored vehicles and absolutely devastating soft targets. The gun is so large and produces so much recoil that the aircraft's engines are mounted high and offset to avoid flameout from gun gas ingestion, and the entire airframe is essentially a flying weapons platform designed to get this gun close enough to the enemy to use it effectively. When Valkyrie 50 November told the Marines they'd hear the gun, she wasn't engaging in dramatic flair. She was giving them a tactical instruction based on the reality that the gun's distinctive sound, a deep, earth-shaking BRRRT that resonated in chest cavities and made the ground vibrate, would be unmistakable even in the chaos of combat. The sound reached them first, echoing down the valley like thunder rolling through canyon walls. Then they saw the aircraft, flying so low that several Marines instinctively ducked even though it was still hundreds of meters away. The A-10 looked like it was skimming the ridge line, its wings level despite the mountainous terrain, coming in from the south exactly as the pilot had promised. Later, when they reviewed the gun camera footage, analysts would calculate that Valkyrie 50 November was flying at approximately 150 feet above ground level through terrain that rose and fell unpredictably, maintaining that altitude through sheer skill, and what one senior pilot described as either massive courage or complete insanity. The first burst from the GAU-8 lasted maybe 2 seconds and walked 30mm rounds across a Taliban position that had been pouring machine gun fire into the Marine position. The effect was apocalyptic. Stone exploded, bodies simply ceased to exist, and the surviving fighters scattered like insects exposed to sudden light. Chaos 3-1, move now. Valkyrie's voice cut through the radio traffic. The platoon sergeant, a staff sergeant named Michaels who'd been in the Corps for 12 years, didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest lance corporal, shouted orders that got passed down the line, and started the withdrawal that would save their lives. The Marines moved in alternating fire teams, one team suppressing while the other displaced, but they didn't have to provide most of the suppression. Valkyrie 50 November was doing that herself. The A-10 made a tight turn that looked physically impossible for an aircraft that size, coming around for another pass that targeted a mortar position the Marines had marked with smoke. The gun sang its terrible song again, and the mortar position disappeared in a cloud of rock dust and fragmented stone. But the Taliban fighters, experienced and dedicated despite their losses, didn't run. They adapted, shifting positions and concentrating fire on the aircraft that was systematically destroying their ambush. The A-10 is heavily armored. The pilot sits in a titanium bathtub designed to withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft fire, but it's not invincible. Small arms fire and RPGs started tracking the aircraft as it made its third pass, and the Marines heard something change in the engine note, a slight roughness that suggested damage. Valkyrie 50, you're taking fire, the platoon commander radioed, stating the obvious but feeling obligated to say something. The response was flat, matter-of-fact. Yeah, I noticed. Keep moving. I'm not done yet. She made 7 more passes through that valley, each one lower than the last, each one more dangerous as the enemy concentrated their remaining forces on trying to bring her down. She expended every 30-millimeter round, then started using her rockets, walking them across fighting positions with precision that suggested intimate familiarity with close air support doctrine, and absolute disregard for the regulations about minimum safe distances. When she ran out of rockets, she made 2 more passes without firing a shot, just the sound of those TF-34 turbofans howling through the valley, the sight of that ungainly aircraft coming in low and fast, and the psychological impact broke what remained of the Taliban's cohesion. They withdrew in disorder, leaving their dead and their weapons, pursued by 30-millimeter rounds from other aircraft that had finally arrived on station. The Marines made it to their defensive position, consolidated their casualties, 5 wounded, none killed, and waited for extraction that came an hour later under the protective circle of aircraft that included 2 more A-10s, a pair of Apache, and the original F-16s that had been too far away to help when help was needed most. Valkyrie 50 November didn't make it back to Bagram. The damage she'd taken wasn't catastrophic, but it was cumulative. Hydraulic lines hit, one engine running rough, damage to the flight control surfaces that made the aircraft progressively harder to control. She diverted to forward operating base Salerno, closer and with a longer runway, and put the wounded Warthog down with what the ground crew described as the best emergency landing they'd ever seen. The aircraft was repairable but would need weeks of work. The pilot was unhurt but was immediately pulled into a series of after-action debriefs that lasted 3 days and resulted in official reprimands for violating engagement distance protocols, for operating outside her assigned patrol area, for ignoring orders from her flight lead to break off and let other assets handle the situation. None of that made it into the official record that the Marines saw, but it filtered down through unofficial channels, through conversations between pilots and ground personnel, through the military gossip network that knew everything before the official announcements came out. What did make it into the record was the Navy Cross recommendation that the platoon commander submitted, endorsed by his company commander, his battalion commander, and every Marine who'd been in that valley. The recommendation detailed every pass, every risk taken, every regulation bent or broken in the service of keeping Marines alive. It was eloquent in its specificity, making clear that this wasn't just good close air support. It was flying that redefined what was possible, that demonstrated mastery of aircraft and terrain and tactical situation to a degree that saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. The recommendation went up the chain, gathering endorsements and moving through the slow bureaucracy of military awards. Then it disappeared. Not denied, not downgraded, just vanished from the system like it had never existed. The official explanation, when anyone bothered to ask, was that the incident was classified pending investigation. The unofficial explanation, passed between Marines who knew how the game was played, was simpler and uglier. Someone with stars on their collar had decided that publicly celebrating a pilot who'd violated that many regulations, even in the service of saving lives, would set a bad precedent. Captain Jamie Cortez, call sign Valkyrie 50 November, received a letter of reprimand in her official file for the Korangal mission. The letter detailed her violations of engagement distance protocols, her failure to comply with orders from higher authority, her operation outside assigned patrol areas, and her general disregard for established procedures. The letter acknowledged that her actions had likely prevented Marine casualties, but it emphasized that military effectiveness required adherence to established rules and that individual judgment, however well-intentioned, could not supersede command authority. The letter would remain in her file and would be considered in all future promotion boards and assignment decisions. She was given a choice, informal but clear: accept the letter and move forward, or fight it and watch her career end in a drawn-out administrative battle she couldn't win. She accepted the letter. 6 months later, she submitted her resignation from the Air Force. The resignation was processed quickly, professionally, with none of the typical exit interviews or retention attempts that might have been made for an officer with her experience and capabilities. Now, 8 years after that mission, after a brief marriage that hadn't survived the transition to civilian life, after a custody battle that had drained her savings and left her with full custody of a son who was her entire world, after a series of jobs that paid the bills but never quite felt right, now she was driving a rusted F-150 with her call sign on the license plate, a quiet act of defiance that said she remembered who she'd been even if the Air Force wanted to forget. And now, because a gunnery sergeant had looked past the rust and read the plate, because word had spread through the tight network of Marines who valued actions over appearances, things were about to change. Not dramatically. There wouldn't be ceremonies or medals or official recognition. But in the unofficial economy of military respect, Jamie Cortez's currency was about to become very valuable. Gunnery Sergeant Price made good on his word. He didn't approach Cortez directly. That would have been too forward, too much like charity. Instead, he made some calls to people he knew, old connections from his years in the Corps, people who owed him favors or who were looking for ways to help veterans who'd fallen through the bureaucratic cracks. He found out where Cortez worked, a small aircraft maintenance facility at Brown Field Municipal Airport, doing inspections and repairs on civilian aircraft. The pay was decent but not generous, and the hours were long, leaving her with limited time for her son and less time for maintaining the truck that was becoming increasingly expensive to keep running. Price also found out where she lived, a modest apartment in National City, a neighborhood that was safe enough but not fancy, chosen because it was in a good school district, and because the rent was something she could afford on her salary. He shared this information carefully, passing it to people who could help without making it obvious that help was being offered. A corporal who'd grown up in a family of mechanics suddenly remembered that his uncle's shop in National City was looking for someone with aircraft maintenance experience, someone who could do contract work on the side with flexible hours and better pay than most civilian facilities offered. A lance corporal whose cousin worked for a nonprofit that helped veterans with housing costs mentioned that they had funds available for security deposits for anyone looking to move into better neighborhoods. A sergeant whose wife taught at a local elementary school made sure that Cortez's son got into the after-school program that provided supervision until 1800 hours, which would give Cortez time to actually work full shifts without worrying about childcare. None of it was direct. All of it was offered through intermediaries, presented as opportunities that had come up through normal channels, carefully constructed so that accepting the help wouldn't feel like accepting charity. Cortez wasn't stupid. She recognized coordination when she saw it, recognized the careful way opportunities were appearing just when she needed them. She could have been angry about it, could have seen it as pity or as interference in her life. Instead, after a week of watching these opportunities materialize, she drove back to Camp Pendleton on a Saturday morning, waited at the visitor center until they could find Gunnery Sergeant Price, and asked to speak with him. They met in the parking lot, the same space where her truck had started this entire chain of events, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and wariness. "Gunny," she said without preamble, "I appreciate what you're doing, really, but I need to know why. I flew one mission 8 years ago. I got Marines out of a bad situation, yeah, but that's the job. That's what close air support pilots do. I don't need to be anyone's project. Price had expected this conversation and had prepared for it, but standing in front of this woman who'd done things he could only imagine, he found his prepared speech inadequate. "Ma'am," he said finally, "it's not about what you need. It's about what we need. The Marines you saved in Koringal, some of them are still in, some of them are out, but all of them know what happened. Word gets around. And when we found out that you were struggling, that you were working 2 jobs and keeping that truck running through sheer determination while the Air Force acted like you never existed," he paused, searching for the right words. "We couldn't let that stand, not when we could do something about it. This isn't charity. This is the Corps taking care of someone who took care of us when it mattered most." Cortez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried an edge that suggested old wounds not fully healed. "The Air Force made it very clear that what I did was wrong, Gunny. They put it in writing. They told me I was reckless, that I endangered myself and my aircraft for insufficient reason, that I should have waited for proper authorization before engaging. They made sure I knew that saving lives didn't excuse breaking rules." Price felt anger rising in his chest, hot and immediate, but he kept his voice level. "Ma'am, with all due respect to your former service, they're wrong. I've been in the Corps for 20 years. I've seen good leadership and bad leadership, good decisions and catastrophically stupid ones. What you did in Koringal was the definition of good decision-making. You assessed the situation, you understood what was needed, and you did what was necessary regardless of the personal cost. That's not recklessness. That's courage." She smiled then, a small expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Courage doesn't pay the rent, Gunny, and it doesn't fix hydraulic leaks in 20-year-old Ford trucks." Price nodded, accepting the truth of that. "No, ma'am, it doesn't, but it does mean something to the people whose lives were affected by it. And sometimes those people are in a position to help with the things that courage doesn't cover, if you'll let them." Cortez looked at him for a long moment, measuring something in his expression that he couldn't identify. Then she extended her hand. "Okay, Gunny, but I'm not taking handouts. Anything your people arrange, I'm earning. Better jobs, better pay, fine, but I'm doing the work and doing it right. No special treatment, no shortcuts. Clear." Price took her hand, his grip firm. "Crystal clear, ma'am. We wouldn't want it any other way." The changes came gradually over the next 3 months, subtle shifts that accumulated into genuine improvement. Cortez started doing contract work for the mechanic in National City, inspections and repairs that paid significantly better than her regular job while requiring less time, freeing up hours she could spend with her son. The after-school program worked perfectly, and her son thrived there, making friends with other military kids who understood deployments and discipline, and the particular kind of pride that came from having parents who'd served. She moved into a better apartment, still modest but in a neighborhood where she didn't worry about break-ins or the elementary school's test scores. The truck, the famous rusted F-150 with its license plate bearing a call sign most Marines recognized by now, got some much-needed maintenance. Not a complete restoration, because Cortez wasn't interested in erasing its character, but enough work to ensure it would run reliably and safely with her son in the passenger seat. And slowly, quietly, she started to reconnect with who she'd been before the letter of reprimand and the resignation and the divorce. She started sleeping better, the chronic tension of financial stress easing enough to let her body finally rest. She started smiling more, particularly when her son would bombard her with questions about flying, or when another Marine would approach her respectfully in a grocery store parking lot, recognizing the license plate and wanting to say thank you. She'd never stopped being proud of what she'd done in Koringal. The letter of reprimand hadn't changed her understanding of whether her actions were right or wrong, but she'd carried the weight of institutional disapproval for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be recognized for competence rather than punished for rule-breaking. The Marines reminded her, not through words but through actions, that there was a different way to measure worth. 6 months after the parking lot encounter, Lance Corporal Rodriguez, The same Marine who'd first mocked the truck and then become one of its most aggressive defenders, was working through a family emergency. His sister's husband had been deployed unexpectedly, leaving her alone with 2 kids under 5 and no immediate support network. Rodriguez was trying to arrange emergency leave to go help her, but the battalion was in a training cycle that made leave difficult, and he was coming up against bureaucratic walls that seemed designed to make helping his family as complicated as possible. He'd mentioned the situation to a few people, more venting frustration than asking for help, and somehow the information had reached Cortez through the network of connections that had formed around her presence in the community. She showed up at his barracks on a Thursday evening, driving the still somewhat rusty F-150, and asked to speak with him. Rodriguez, mortified that his problems had somehow reached the attention of a woman he'd come to regard as something close to a personal hero, tried to wave her off. "Ma'am, it's fine. I'm handling it," he stammered. Cortez gave him a look that he suspected had been very effective when she was an officer dealing with young aircrew. "Rodriguez, I've got a 7-year-old son and a functional understanding of single-parent logistics. Your sister needs help, you're stuck here, and I've got flexible hours and no current plans to be anywhere else this weekend. Give me her address. I'll go check on her, make sure she's got what she needs, and help with the kids until you can get there." Rodriguez started to protest, but she cut him off. "This isn't up for discussion, Lance Corporal. This is how it works. People helped me when I needed it. Now I'm helping someone else who needs it. You'll do the same for someone else eventually. That's how we take care of each other." She drove 6 hours to Rodriguez's sister's house, showed up with her own son and bags of groceries, and spent 3 days helping with childcare, cooking meals, and providing the kind of practical support that made the difference between surviving and drowning. Rodriguez's sister, a Navy wife who'd seen enough of military life to recognize competence when she encountered it, later told her brother that Cortez was the most squared-away human I've ever met who wasn't actively serving. When Rodriguez finally got his emergency leave approved and made it to his sister's house, he found his nieces playing with Cortez's son, the kitchen stocked with pre-made meals labeled with heating instructions, and a handwritten note from Cortez that simply said, "Your sister's solid. Kids are great. Call if you need anything else." The story spread, as such stories do in the tight communities that form around military bases. The narrative evolved from the pilot with the rusty truck to Valkyrie, who takes care of people. The license plate became a symbol not just of past service, but of present character, a rolling billboard for the idea that competence and dedication didn't end when the uniform came off. Marines started seeking her out for advice on everything from aircraft maintenance to dealing with transitions to civilian life. She never advertised herself as a counselor or mentor, but she made time for the conversations, sharing hard-won lessons about navigating VA bureaucracy, about finding work that felt meaningful, about maintaining identity when the institutional structure that had defined you for years suddenly disappeared. Her apartment became an unofficial gathering place for transitioning veterans, particularly those struggling with the gap between their service accomplishments and their civilian job prospects. Gunnery Sergeant Price watched this evolution with satisfaction that he kept carefully private. He'd started this with the simple goal of making sure someone who'd saved Marine lives didn't have to struggle with basic survival. But it had become something larger, something that transcended the original mission. Cortez had become a bridge between active duty and veteran communities, a living example of how service continued even after discharge, how the skills and dedication learned in uniform could be applied to building communities and helping others. He'd seen plenty of veterans become bitter about their treatment by the military, seen good people turn angry and isolated because they'd been discarded after their usefulness ended. Cortez could have gone that route, probably should have gone that route, given how she'd been treated. Instead, she'd chosen to remain connected, to take the respect being offered and use it to build something worthwhile. One evening in December, almost a year after the parking lot encounter, Price received a call on his personal cell from a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously, and Cortez's voice came through with background noise that suggested she was calling from somewhere busy. "Gunny, it's Jamie Cortez. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Price felt a moment of concern. Had something gone wrong? Had someone crossed a line with their help? "Of course, ma'am. What do you need?" There was a pause, and then, "I've been offered a job, teaching aviation maintenance at a technical school in Oceanside. Better pay, better hours, benefits, and it would let me work with veterans transitioning to civilian aviation careers. It's the kind of opportunity I never thought I'd get without a different ending to my Air Force career. But I need to know, did someone in your network arrange this? Because if they did, I need to know now before I accept." Price smiled, genuinely surprised. "Ma'am, I swear to you this is the first I'm hearing about it." "What school?" she told him, and he recognized the name. A respected facility with a solid reputation and good job placement rates. Not a place that would create positions for political reasons or as favors. "Ma'am, that sounds legitimate. You should take it if you want it. You're qualified, you've got real-world experience they'd kill to have on their teaching staff, and you've been doing informal mentoring for months now. This isn't charity, this is someone recognizing talent." Another pause, longer this time. Okay, I'll accept it, but Gunny, thank you for everything, for seeing past the rust, for getting people to help without making it obvious, for giving me back something I thought I'd lost." Price felt unexpected emotion tighten his throat. "Ma'am, we didn't give you anything. We just made sure people could see what was already there." Jamie Cortez started her new job in January, teaching aviation maintenance to classes filled with veterans, active duty transitioning personnel, and civilian students who wanted careers in aviation. She was good at it, patient with students who were struggling, demanding with students who were coasting, and absolutely uncompromising about safety and attention to detail. Her teaching style reflected her flying, precise, focused, and deeply rooted in the understanding that aviation didn't forgive carelessness. Her students learned quickly that good enough wasn't acceptable in her classroom, but they also learned that she would stay late to help anyone who was genuinely trying, that she had practical solutions to problems that stumped other instructors, and that she'd been places and done things that made her stories worth listening to. She never talked about Coringle unless specifically asked, and even then she kept her descriptions technical and unemotional, focusing on decision-making processes rather than drama. But word got around, as it always did, and students started her classes knowing they were learning from someone who'd proven competence under conditions most of them would never face. The rusted F-150, still bearing its distinctive license plate, became a familiar sight in the school's parking lot. It was less rusted now. Cortez had finally had time and resources to address the worst of the body damage, but she'd kept its essential character, refusing offers from students to do a full restoration. "It's honest," she explained to a student who asked why she didn't upgrade to something newer. "It shows where it's been and what it's done. I like that about it." The student, a former Army mechanic who'd done 3 tours in Iraq, nodded understanding. He got it. They all got it. The truck was a rolling metaphor for military service, worn by experience, damaged by hard use, still functional and still serving. Worth respecting not despite its scars but because of them. 2 years after the parking lot encounter, the Marines of 1st Battalion 5th Marines were conducting a memorial ceremony for their deployment casualties, a somber event held each year to honor those who hadn't made it home. The ceremony was small and private, attended mostly by unit members and families of the fallen. But this year, someone had suggested inviting specific people who'd made significant impacts on unit members during deployments. The battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel who'd been a platoon commander during a different deployment but who understood the cultural significance of the Coringle mission, personally called Jamie Cortez and asked if she would attend. She hesitated. She didn't like ceremonies, didn't like being put on display, didn't like the complicated emotions that came with formal recognition. But the lieutenant colonel had been persuasive, making clear that this wasn't about glorifying her, but about acknowledging connection between ground and air, between those who called for help and those who answered. She attended, wearing simple civilian clothes because she no longer had a uniform that fit and wouldn't have worn it if she did, standing in the back of the formation while Marines read names and shared stories. Then Gunnery Sergeant Price, now Sergeant Major Price, having picked up his promotion earlier that year, stepped forward and said something that wasn't in the program. Today we honor those who fell in combat, and we remember that their sacrifice was in service of missions and brothers who survived, because others did their jobs with courage and skill. One of those people is here today, someone who saved 32 Marines in Korangal Valley, when saving them required violating orders, risking her aircraft, and making decisions that ended her military career but kept families intact. Captain Jamie Cortez, call sign Valkyrie 50 November, stood between Marines and death and refused to back down until everyone was safe. We don't have a medal to give her and she doesn't want recognition, but we need her to know, and we need everyone here to know that we remember, that the Marines she saved remember, that this battalion remembers, and that her action represents everything we aspire to as a service, putting mission and people above personal consequence. The formation broke into applause, not the polite courtesy clapping of military ceremonies, but genuine, sustained applause that came from men and women who understood exactly what Price was describing. Cortez stood frozen, overwhelmed by emotion she'd kept locked down for years, and felt tears streaming down her face that she made no attempt to hide. Her son, standing beside her, looked up with an expression of confused pride, not quite understanding why everyone was clapping for his mom, but understanding that it was important. Price approached after the ceremony and she hugged him without words, a brief tight embrace that said everything that needed saying. "You gave me my call sign back," she said finally when she could speak. "I thought it was gone. I thought I'd lost it when they forced me out, but you gave it back." Price shook his head gently. "Ma'am, we didn't give you anything. It was always yours. We just made sure people remembered it." The rusted F-150 with license plate 50 NRTH still drives around San Diego County, a little less rusty now but still bearing the honorable scars of use and time. People see it sometimes, in parking lots or at stop lights, and some of them know what those characters mean. Some of them served, or know someone who served, or heard the story that moves through military communities like scripture. And when they see that plate, they remember that competence matters more than appearance, that service doesn't end with discharge, and that the people who do difficult things rarely look like heroes in the movies. They look like single parents driving old trucks, working 2 jobs, raising kids, and choosing every day to stay connected to communities that need them. They look, in other words, like the best people who ever wore the uniform, unremarkable until circumstances demand excellence, and then absolutely remarkable when they deliver it. Jamie Cortez drove that truck because it ran, and because she'd learned long ago that you don't need approval from people who don't understand to know your own worth. But she appreciated, more than she could express, being reminded by people who did understand that worth is recognized not by the institutions that pin on medals, but by the communities that see what matters. The Marines had laughed at the truck, then they'd read the license plate, and then they'd understood.